Right. Good evening, everyone. Good evening. Just to say welcome to those who are actually in the hall, in the Methodist chapel, I should say, sorry, the Methodist chapel this evening. But we're also broadcasting on Zoom as usual. So we've got some remote viewers as well who they'll be listening in. It's a slightly complicated evening, which I'll explain in a moment. So do bear with us if there's any other technical difficulties. But anyway, it's a special evening this evening because all the year the committee work hard to put together talks for our heritage group. But this is the evening in theory where the committee sit back and some of our members give a talk. Actually, with all the technical stuff these days, it doesn't seem to make much difference because the committee has still been rushing around with wires and, as you see, lots of gadgets. But we're going to have two direct talks from members, starting with Jenny Greaves in a moment, and then on to Malcolm Fletcher. And the third talk this evening is a bit of a cheat because it is a members talk, but John Diamond is going to talk shortly about an item which we acquired in the Heritage Centre earlier in the year, but hasn't been on display yet. So hence the secret grey box at the front, which will be revealed later on. The plan of action is that we'll have Jenny's talk first and then have a break for tea and coffee. That will allow a little bit more shuffling around of things, and that should work, we hope, fingers crossed. So we'll do it that way. And then, of course, later on in the evening, we'll let you know we've got another meeting coming up, oddly enough, in a couple of weeks' time, because our Christmas meeting is on the 14th of December. We don't wait until the fourth Monday in December, and that'll be in the Memorial Hall because it's our slightly light-hearted Christmas event, which will mean we can serve a glass of alcohol, which we can't do in here. And that we have something that I'll tell you about that a bit later on about what that entails. So this evening's talk, we'll start off with Jenny talking about the undertaking, the opus magnus that she's been working on for the last 18 months, couple of years. She'll tell us about that. Those of you who were in the church recently will have seen the first reveal, but this I'm sure will be a slightly different spin, can I use that phrase, on the All-Born Gospels. So I'll hand over to Jenny if she's ready.
Welcome to this presentation on the 5 B's of the All-Born Gospels. The All-Born Gospels are the 4 Gospels of the Bible. It's an illuminated style, medieval style manuscript, and almost every page is illustrated with something to do with the village of Aldbourne. It was completed in 2022 after about almost 4 years of work. Most medieval manuscripts are made with vellum, which is an animal skin, a calf skin, but I'm pleased to tell you that the All-Born Gospels was made on paper, and so no cows were harmed in the making thereof. It has 267 pages. Most medieval manuscripts were made by a team of scribes and different people. It was very much a piecemeal operation. Somebody prepared the parchment, somebody else prepared the paper. Normally a team of scribes would have done the writing in a room called a scriptorium. Another scribe would have done the drawing, another scribe the colouring, and another one the gilding, and then someone else would have taken the covers together, organised them, stitched them and bound them. For the All-Born Gospels, one person was involved. The language of the All-Born Gospels is English, and in 2 forms. There are 2 columns on each page, and the left column is the John Wycliffe translation of the Bible. It was the first translation of the Bible into English, and it's unauthorized. But John Wycliffe firmly believed that all people should be able to hear the stories of the Bible in their own language. So that language is Middle English, so late 1300s, so late 14th century. Because this was a little bit obtuse, I also included on the right-hand column the King James translation of 1611. It was published in 1611. So you're looking there at late 16th, early 17th century English. And it just happens to be my favorite version of the Bible. And the binding of the Bible, no jewels like the Book of Kells or Lindisfarne, but it is covered with leather. And I would just reiterate that no cows were harmed in the process of making thereof. However, 1 or 2 goats may have sacrificed their skins. So this is a goat skin cover. And this is sort of, it's like a leather mosaic that decorates it. And if you recognize this, it's from the stained glass windows in the church of St. Mary Magdalene, to whom our church used to be dedicated. So the 5 Bs. So why 5 Bs? Whenever I meet people who are new to the village and I'm trying to explain a potted version of the history of Aldbourne, I tend to use the 5 Bs because it's easy to remember. And I go in chronological order, and that's even easier to remember. So if I start with the barrows, obviously we have a lot of ancient barrows around Aldbourne, and the most famous of which are the 4 barrows. And this is a double page. On the left-hand side, there's an illustration of the 4 barrows, and on the right, it's the Scots pines. The significance of the cross in these pictures is because on Easter Sunday, we have a sunrise service to which anyone is invited to come. It's a lovely, quiet, contemplative service in the open air, sometimes a bit chilly, and we do try to get to the barrows by sunrise. And of course, can't really talk about barrows without talking about some of the excavations, and of course the Aldbourne Cup, which is found in the barrow just beyond, or a barrow near the 4 barrows. And this is the lid of the Aldbourne Cup, and this is the base. Second B are bells, of which of course there are many in our history, and 8 in the church. So these are the different illustrations of our 8 bells, and each bell has its own page. On average, it's roughly about 2 bells per gospel. But of course, we have an awful lot more to our bell history than those 8 bells. And there are about 24 pages in the Aldbourne Gospels, which looks or remembers, commemorates, celebrates our bell heritage. The third B is Aldbourne Band. So there are a few pictures, actually 3 pages for the Aldbourne Band. The first one is really the precursor to the Aldbourne Band. This is the west window in the church by the tower, where there used to be a gallery for musicians, and a band of musicians would play for the services. But when the Victorians refurbished the church, or restored the church in 1867, they did away with that gallery and they replaced the band with a surpliced choir and an organ. So some members of the band became the first members of the Aldbourne Band as is today. The letter T at the bottom here, these are flugelhorns. And I thought it was quite appropriate on this page to have horns and talking about the band, because it says, therefore, when thou doest thine alms, do not sound a trumpet before thee, as the hypocrites do in the synagogues. One of the founders of Aldbourne Band was Richard Brown Bunce, who was also the organist in the church. And behind the organist outside is his grave. And this is a picture of his grave. But this was a page which was also looking at the cow parsley that grows in the village in May. And May was the time that I was writing this particular piece. And on the page opposite this page, there is an illustration which remembers rectory wood and the cow parsley that grows there. And on this side, Richard Brown Bunce. And there's a little poem that goes with it. And this half of the poem is, in the churchyard's slumbering space, Richard Brown Bunce has his place, richly veiled with Queen Anne's lace. And this picture is based on an old Victorian picture of the band. I think it's one of the oldest pictures that we have. And here you have the letters A made with a harp and a treble clef, and the staves with the swifts on are inspired by the band's album cover. And finally, with the band, this was written, or these particular pages were written at about the time of the summer proms concert. And so this is why I slightly went to town here and had a fantastic time doing my Union flags and dabchicks, euphonium, trombone, bass drum. And the fourth B is another band, the Band of Brothers. So this is my Band of Brothers page. I did forget to make the eagle scream, for which I apologise, but it is an eagle. John Diamond very kindly suggested that I include one of the parachute D-rings because this page was created just after the Nightingale dig on the field back in 2019. So these are the parachute rings, and here the background is a picture of parachutes coming from the sky. And on the subject of Band of Brothers, of course, I wanted to remember a lot of our other wartime heroes who were contemporary with the Americans who were in the village. This page is dedicated to Eleanor Hawkins, who married Mr. Cherami and fought with the resistance in France to help the stranded airmen. This page is about the betrayal of Judas. So I thought it was highly appropriate when Eleanor Hawkins was betrayed to the Gestapo and put in a prisoner of war camp. She survived, but she did suffer terribly. And she received about 11 awards, I believe it was, and these are 9 of them here. Another of our war people, or heroes, I suppose, is Cecil Newton, who this is the picture here of his tank. There's a photograph of that. So Cecil's here at the left. And of course, he was present at the D-Day landings and also at Operation Market Garden, which the 101st Airborne Division were also at. And opposite Cecil's page is the page for Phyllis Bull. She flew with a lot of the Dakota aircraft to give medical assistance, nursing assistance in the theatres of war. This page is about the Searchlight camp that used to be up at Westfield, where Westfield Chase now is. And this was based on a few reminiscences of that time that I heard in the Aldbourne oral histories. So I thought it would be quite good to actually include something of that time. And on the page opposite that is the black pear tree of the Worcestershire Regiment. The Worcesters were here in the Civil War, obviously in a previous guise, if you like, but they were here in the Civil War. They were also here in the First World War and in the Second World War. And this page is in memory of a woman who's buried in our churchyard and has caused me a great deal of mystery, and I still don't know the answer to this. Edith Doucet was killed when Sloane Square Tube Station was bombed in the Blitz, and she lived in Sloane Square. But I cannot find a connection with Aldbourne. She doesn't seem to have any family connections, and I can only assume that she had friends here, which is possible, having seen what her work was, and it is possible that she would have visited the village a few times, but clearly knew somebody well enough to be buried here. And the final B is B for Bessie, which is my Doctor Who page. So Bessie was the car that Doctor Who was driving around when he was at Devil's End, because at that time he was landlocked and there was no TARDIS or Daleks in the Doctor Who and the Demons that was filmed in Aldbourne. On the page opposite that, you have the Blue Boar and the Cloven Hoof, which of course the Blue Boar was turned into for the Doctor Who series. So those were my 5 Bs. And here on this page, I've just put 6 B's as they appear in the Auburn Gospels on various pages. There aren't many B's. Most of the initial letters in the Gospels are A's or T's, and there are not many other ones. There are 7 B's altogether. This B is from the page with the searchlight and the Worcesters. This B is from a page for James Bridgman, our last bell founder. This B is on the page for Bell Court, where bells were founded. This B is on the page for the the Valley View Saxon burial site. This page is for Mike Hellier's house up at Westleys. And this B is for the 6th bell in the tower. And that concludes my presentation. Thank you very much for listening.
Well, good evening. This talk couldn't be in greater contrast to Jenny's opus magnus. And it's a simple talk, really. And it's all about the type of houses that people built in the very early days of Holborn. And we're including in Holborn the whole of the Holborn Basin, which is really the area between the ridge that starts in Baden, goes round to Womburgh, Liddington, Upham, Snap, Southwood Common, including Chase Woods. And that's the whole of the Holborn Basin, because in the old days, Holborn was really controlled from Upham, and all that was considered as Holborn. Now, throughout ages, up to about 1800, people who built houses, and we're not talking about prestigious houses here, but the ordinary vernacular is the phrase, but the ordinary people's houses. And they always had a principle of building their houses from the materials that they could find locally. And that's all they needed. But they did also need water, because they needed water for their animals and for themselves. So the key ingredient for any house was local materials. And this carried on for a long, long time. So we're going to start with the Ice Age. 12,000 BC. And the ice extended down to the north side of the Thames, but it didn't come as far as Holborn. And but there would have been permafrost here. And the one thing we do know, that there was no houses from the Ice Age in Holborn. But gradually the ice retreated, and this was the first example of global warming. And it was not caused by fossil fuels, nor was it commented on by Attenborough. So we came back 4,000 years to 4,000 BC, when there was the first signs of people. And one of the earliest skeletons ever found from this era was in Cheddar Gorge in a cave. So the archaeologists know roughly what the people were like, and they were smaller than we are. Certainly died at half our age or a third of our age in some cases. But they did slowly move up into our area. And the first people were called hunter-gatherers, and they weren't fixed. They didn't build settlements, and they used to live on what they could find that was growing locally or from the animals. And they moved on wherever they could find something to live off. They lived off it. And when it ran out, they moved. And there were very few of them. It's been said that in the 120 square miles of Salisbury Plain, it supported about 15 lots of hunter-gatherers, 15 families. So you can see that Holborn would be almost deserted, and it was uninhabited for centuries. But they all lived on the higher ground wherever they lived. Most of it was covered by trees, and they got water from dew ponds. And a dew pond is a depression in the earth lined with clay, And DuPont's carried on for a long time, and significantly, in the Oldbourne churchyard, there's a gravestone from a man called William Walker, who died in 1940. And on his gravestones, he says he was the last of a long line of DuPont makers. Coming forward in time, there was population change, and this came into what's called the Neolithic era. And people started to make settlements, still living on higher ground. And from this era, about 3000 BC, became the great monuments for which Wessex and Wiltshire is well known. That's Avebury, Stonehenge, Wayland Smithy, Long Kennet, West Kennet, Long Barrow. And these were all made about this time. But the houses these people lived in were very similar to the hunter-gatherers. And this is the sort of house that they lived in. And these are examples built at Stonehenge. And this is an English heritage slide. And as you can see, there's a man with a mobile phone trying to take a picture. But these houses were really quite small. They had a central hearth. There was a National Geographic publication on Stonehenge recently that said they were 16 feet by 16 feet. But in fact, I think most of the houses from this era were round, because it's much easier to build a round house than a square house, because all your timbers are the same length, more or less. So these houses were really quite interesting. And the walls tended to be made from wattle, intertwined and covered with chalk plaster. And this is an example of a wattle and daub wall. And this is from one of the interior walls of our house in the old bit. So it's not from Stonehenge, but it gives you an example of how they built their houses. And they used to have posts, and they just woven these inside, and then there's skimming of the chalk. But there's no proof really that there was a megalithic Oldbourne. Coming through the Bronze Age and the Iron Age, the people continued to live on the ridges. And in spite of the great finds from this era, which is the Oldbourne Cup, which is about 1700 BC, and of course the Four Barrows, which have been mentioned, about 1200 BP, those developments didn't really establish that there was any significant settlement here, certainly not in the valley bottom. But gradually, they used to move their animals to the valley bottom, and particularly cattle went down to the valley bottom whilst the sheep remained on the hills. And there is a suggestion, particularly in the Oxford Vale, that this was the origin of this phrase, different as chalk and cheese, was the sheep on the hills and the cheese from the bottom in the valley. And really nobody lived here much. But next came the Romans, and the Romans came about 43 AD to Britain, and they left about 440 AD. And they were, of course, tremendous builders. They could build anything. And they put their mark on this area by Ermine Street, which goes through Baden, as you know. And there are significant Roman remains. At Upham, when we were looking for a house many years ago, we looked at a house which had a Roman remains in the garden. And of course, there is the magnificent pavement at Littlecote, which is tremendous, really. And quite recently, it was on the news tonight, they've discovered a new pavement in Rutlandshire, I think, which is comparable. So the Romans came, and there is evidence that they came to the village. John tells me that when they were excavating for the houses in Barnes Yard, they found a Roman coin. And certainly at North Farm, which is quite close to Ermine Street, really, they found Roman remains. But you can really say that there was no Roman Oldbourne. Now, one of the interesting things, and this influenced the whole development of the village really, was water. Settlements needed water for their animals, and they really needed a year-long source, not just a bourne which flows part of the year. And we're lucky in a way in that the Marlborough Downs have a tremendous resource of water. On the surface, it's all chalk, and occasionally there are patches of clay on the top. But this picture shows why the Marlborough Downs are so important, is that beneath them, there's a layer of Oxford clay, this brown line, and that contains all the water. So when it rains, the water comes down, about half of it, well, some runs off, some evaporates, but most of it, half of it, say, trickles down into the chalk, and it trickles down very slowly. It goes down at about 3 foot a year or something. But over the years, the chalk has become like a big sponge, and it contains all this water. And as you can see, the lines of the water surface are up near the ground level. And as we know, in the village, the water surface sometimes floods. Water does flood here and always has done. The centre of the village was just a marshy area with an irregular pond, shall we say. And a study's been done which shows the depth of the low water, that's the driest years. And this was done by the university about 30 years ago. And it shows that the water level on the driest year that they identified goes down 30 feet. Now, to dig a well 30 feet in the early days was virtually impossible. You had antler picks, and the shovels were made from the bones, the shoulder bones of cows and things, or oxen. So digging a well that side was really quite difficult. Now, the people who were looking around for water decided that the best place to have a look was on the spring lines. And the spring lines are well known by anybody who's watched it flood here. Just above Brown's Farm, if you go up the main road, you'll find the potholes. Potholes are there almost every year, and they're on the spring line. And similarly, going up Lottage Road, where the spring comes out, is remarkably short distance. And on the other side of the hills, also, there is a similar sort of place. The spring lines are very attractive, and Ashbury, Bishopston, and Womburgh are all on the spring lines on the other side of the crest. So the Marlborough Downs are really quite useful. It's been said that they supply 40% of the south of England with water by pumping it down the river. And there was a scheme that Thames Water had to put big pumps in Oldbourne and pump more water down the river. And they did this in the Lambourne Valley. And it's still working today, of course. Anyway, the water was very useful in some ways, but it's a menace if you want to build some houses in the middle of the village. And so there was no real housing done where it was wet. But the Romans came and they built all these structures. And although there was no Roman Oldbourne, people were attracted to the spring lines, and they did tend to have wells and built houses down here. And of course, up to about 1900, every house in the village had its own well. And but they wouldn't have reached the dry weather flows. And I have wondered whether that's why we have two sort of corporate wells in the village. And it would be interesting to find out how deep they go. Quite a big job, but that may be the origin of those wells. Now, having decided that water was available, the people's next job was to make better houses. And the obvious place to look was at the chalk. And chalk is a very funny material. It's really only occurs in the southeast of England and in the north of France. And there's very little anywhere else in the world. And it's very variable. Geologists divide it up into 3 types. That's upper, middle, and lower. And it tends to get stronger with depth, but it can let you down horribly because it has deep washed out valleys or infilled valleys in it and sinkholes. And there was always a sinkhole near Baden on the road from Baden to Lambourne Woodlands, which the council used to repair every year. And it cracked again. And then finally, somebody got down to it and put a proper slab over the top, which now carries the traffic, and we haven't had potholes there ever since. But one of the most spectacular buried valleys is near Ipswich. And this was work, we were drilling in the chalk there when they rang me up and said, Malcolm, there is no chalk. And I said, what do we do? I said, you keep drilling. And they drilled 45 meters into the ground before they found any chalk. And this was a buried valley, which the geologist and myself wrote a paper about. It was just so spectacular. So chalk can let you down, but don't get depressed, because when you pick up a piece, it can be quite friable. But it does make very good chalk walls. And this is Claire's house, number 8, the green, has this chalk wall at the back. And that's quite old. And it's really been quite successful. It's strong. It has some advantages, chalk, actually, to anybody who lives in the middle of this village, because it's a funny characteristic. When you put a weight on it, and when you build a house, and we can certainly design for 1 ton per square foot on this chalk, the chalk settles as it should, but then it doesn't settle anymore. And there's no what we call secondary consolidation. But once it's settled, it doesn't move. And similarly, it doesn't swell or shrink as the weather changes. So chalk is really not a bad foundation material. And if you want to see an example, of course, the best structure in the village is the church tower, 100 feet high, and that's founded on chalk, and it's hardly settled at all. There is a funny thing with the building regulations, which you have to comply with. But when we lived in Whitley Lodge, which is a significant 2-story house, we put a conservatory on the end, and the building regulations said we had to go so deep for the conservatory. But the foundations of the conservatory were substantially deeper than the foundation of the house next to it. And they're both still standing up. So the chalk is really quite attractive. And there were 3 chalk pits in Oldbourne that were used. The one that's well documented is behind the houses in the Butts, where the gardens are now. There was a chalk pit there. Then going up Baden Hill, halfway up, about where Rendals live, there was a pit there. And straight up at the top, just underneath the windmill, there's a chalk pit there. And you can't see any of them now, they're all filled in. But halfway up Baden Hill, there's this very nice chalk cottage. And it's got a date on which is 1853. So they were building chalk walls as late as 1850. And that's unpainted, stands up, very nice. You'll notice that they've reinforced the edges with bricks. Now, bricks are really quite useful. They've been used for 2,500 years in Mesopotamia, in the early Indus Basin places like Harappa and in Egypt. And I have actually handled it, picked it off the ground, a 2,500 BC brick in Harappa. And the problem in Oldbourne is that there isn't very much clay, and to make bricks you need clay. And there are 2 places where brickworks were identified. One is Brick Kiln Cottage. If you go on Beating the Bounds, you will almost walk through the garden of Brick Kiln Cottage. It's on the Ramsbury border over the top of the common. And there's another one near Baden, really, just outside, where there's a bit on the map called Brick Kiln Copse. And I'm assured by an architect who lives locally there that there was a brickworks there. But you can say that bricks were not the preferred building material for Holborn's houses, though they are quite useful. Well, they would be too expensive. The chalk would be much cheaper. But they are quite useful to stabilize the corners of the chalk and stop it getting weathered. So chalk is not a failure, really. And the people who were using it, they built their houses now with thatch wall, with chalk walls, always with thatch on. Thatch is interesting because anybody who lives in the centre of the village, you can tell whether your house did have thatch on before the fires by the angle of the roof. And to make a thatched roof durable, you need 45 degrees as a minimum. So like that, 50 degrees is better. So all you have to look at all the tiled roofs and think, well, there's a fire there, and that house now used to have thatch on it. But they found, when they came down to the valley bottom and started looking for building materials, they found something that was much better than chalk. That's sarsen stones, the brown stones. And sarsen's been quite well documented, obviously, because half of Stonehenge is sarsen, almost all of Avebury is sarsen. And at ground level, you can see very good examples of big sarsen stones in Lockridge. They're at the surface, Fifield. And it's said that there was 1 or 2 large stones up near Woodsend. I haven't been up to look, and I don't know if they're still there. But the small sarsen stones that most of the houses in the village are built from are an excellent building material. They're very hard. The geological name is chert, and it's a sort of silica. And the geologists don't quite agree how they were formed, but there are a lot of them. And if you want to know how your house wall is built, whether it's built from chalk or sarsen, all you have to do is try to drill a small hole in it, because the sarsens are very hard to drill. But very successful and very, very widespread in the village. I mean, all the houses as built would be brown, and a lot have been whitewashed, as it used to be called, and now snow sem or weather shield. But the ones that have been brown are very good houses still. And they also needed mortar. And there was another problem in Holborn with mortar, in that mortars in those days was lime and sand. You need 1 part of lime to 2 or 3 parts of sand. And there was a big shortage of sand in the village. There is a sand pit marked on Southwood Common, but that's the only one. And I think they would have to have had imported the sand from further down the river valleys in order to make the mortar. But there we are. Sarsen stones were a big success, and they are very durable. They'll last longer than the bricks will. Now, we go forward, and the next thing that happened, the Romans came, the Romans went, and the Saxons came. And the Saxons penetrated into Britain. And it's said that they came across the channel, of course, not in inflatable boats. And they tended to traverse the south of England by going up the river valleys. And they certainly came to Ramsbury quite early on. And we know this because in Barbara Croucher's excellent book on Ramsbury, it's described they had an iron forge there, which they found almost on the high street. And that was carbon dated to get the date correct. And it was somewhere about 800 AD. And Ramsbury was an ecclesiastical centre, even in those days. It's rather taken us over since then. But the first bishop of Ramsbury was in 909 AD, which is very early. And it's thought that as an outlier from Ramsbury, there would have been Saxon people coming to live in the Holborn area. And probably between 900 and 970, 980 were the first real residents of the Valley Bottom. But I think, and people might correct me on this, I don't think there've been any real proof of the Saxons that still exist. But that could be corrected. But then we come on, the next people who came were the Normans. And of course, they got us organized, and they well documented the village development. And in 1066, John in his talk said that there were 76 residents of Holborn, and it's not clear that that was probably, they only counted the men, I suspect. They didn't count the families. And when we came on to the Domesday Book, which was, well, the year varies, but it's about 1086, it was said that, I'll get the numbers right, that Holborn had 126 households. And that's quite a small village, really. But that includes Upham and all the peripheral buildings. But they did want to build a church. It's said that the Saxons built a wooden church, but the Normans got down to it and they built the original church. And they realized that there wasn't any good stone, real good stone in Holborn, and they imported the stone for the columns, many of the columns anyway, of the old part of the church. And it probably came from Malmesbury, although Jenny and myself had a tour by a stonemason quite recently, didn't we? And he disputed some of those facts, including saying that one of the columns is made of Bath stone, and it is. But nevertheless, the Saxons came, the Normans came, and the Normans got us organized. And the next development could be said that the church tower was built. This was about 1460. If ever I get down to it, I'll give a talk on how they built the church tower, because it's fascinating to build a tower 100 feet high in those days. And they would have wooden scaffolding, but they had to lift up all those stones, which came here on ox carts. The stones weren't cut in the village. But building the tower is a fascinating job. And of course, it's been remarkably successful. The corners of the stone, the external corners, are still quite sharp 700 years later. So we come up then to 1400. And as far as we know, the one thing that we don't know is which was the first inhabited house in the village. In the centre of the village, the earliest date I've heard of is 1643. And that's on a lintel over the fireplace in Yew Tree Cottage, which is just across from the post office where Warwick and Valerie Hood live. And John is the person who found this date by observing the light at a certain angle on this beam. But we do need more information from that era. But my theory at the moment is that the earliest inhabited house in the village is the old priest's house. And for those who don't know where that is, that's behind Rose Cottage, where Mrs. Brown used to live. And it's quite hard to get to. Now, why do I think that? That's an example of the end of a house and its pointed house. That's a sarsen wall, and it shows the sarsen wall with the thatch. That's a fine example of the thatch, which covers a chalk wall. And that's sixpenny, of course, which has got this marvellous thatch over the roof, And thatch was used really until for the ordinary people's houses, until tiles could be imported, because I suspect that there was no tile works in Albourne. Now, why I think Priest House is the oldest is because it's a crook house, C-R-U-K, and crooks are pieces of timber which support the roof. And it's a continuous piece of timber from the ground up to the ridge point. And that was formed by pieces of a tree. And there are a lot of crooks houses, mostly in the West Midlands and in the Welsh Marches. And they've been studied quite widely because they're so interesting. And there are very few so far south in England, but they do start to proliferate a bit as you go into South Oxfordshire, in Steventon and Harwell, places like that. They do have one or two examples of crook houses. And this is just an example to show you the structural timbers. And these were quite big trees. I mean, if that was in oak, it would probably have taken 50 years to grow an oak tree that high. And the carpenters, who were village carpenters, but they probably traveled around, had quite a big job cutting the trees, getting them into, well, finding the trees, getting them into place, putting them on the ground. And they put the arch on the ground, two pieces of wood like that, and they lifted it up into position and wedged it somehow till they did the next one. And most of these crook houses were built just with 3 bays, and they were long barn-like structures. There would have been no windows. There'd probably been no chimney, but they were structures of an era, which is quite useful for dating buildings. And there is a record in Maurice Crane's book, which is written in 1974 about, which refers to the vicar John Stone, who was a vicar from about 1480 to 1510. And he has this magnificent tomb in the church, which is certainly worth having a look at. And it is said that he lived in the priest's house. And with John's help, we tried to get his will recently. Well, we did get his will written in Old English, which John translated, but there was no mention of where he lived. And I still need to find a document which confirms what Maurice Crane wrote, was that John Stone lived in the old priest's house. And he may have been owned by the church in those days, because these houses were the upper end. These were the executive houses of the era, shall we say. Now, I was very lucky to be shown around recently by Emma Gardner, who got all this publicity at the beginning of the show for some reason which she probably doesn't know. But Emma gave me a tour, and they're painstakingly restoring the old priest house. And it's fascinating inside. They have done some modern additions, but she and her husband and family lived there. And you can go inside and see the crook beams which support the roof. And some of them are really quite big pieces of timber, 9 to 12 inches square. And they're visible inside. It's really a treat if ever you can get invited to a party there. It's worth having a look. But I do thank Emma for that. So we do know the era of crook houses. The first one that's been carbon dated was 1285, and the majority of them were built between 1400 and 1500. And it fixes a time anyway. And what we need now is more information. To conclude this talk, really, it would be helpful if anybody who lives in one of the old houses could hunt around and see if they can find a date or anything that gives an inkling of when the houses in the middle of the village were built. And of course, the really nice thing would be to get Wiltshire Archaeology to come and carbon date one or two of the houses. and it doesn't cost much. I'm going to have a go and see if we can do that. But the big thing to end this talk is that if anybody's got any more information to add to this story, please, anything before 1500 or even 1600, say, please tell somebody from the Heritage Group or me. So thank you for listening. These are the earliest houses in Holborn. It's all a bit speculative, other than the facts that the Normans documented. Thank you very much, and thanks for coming.
Obviously, thank you, Malcolm, for that insight into the very earliest styles of structure in possibly in the village. And actually, it's a sort of open-ended talk, isn't it? Because it sort of leads on to what followed that. And it was only the other day when I took an order for a link run in the village, and somebody told me that they lived in the 1600s end of the house. And I was intrigued. And this is Westfield farmhouse along West Street. And although a lot of it is more modern, and that appears to be where Kate Lyle lives, that's what I was talking to. I'm sure she don't mind me mentioning. Apparently she said that's from the 1600s. She lives in the cottage bit. So whether that's an extra piece of information, Malcolm.
Yes, well, it is, isn't it? Yeah. Cottage certainly has thatch on because it's like that.
Yes, so it's interesting. Question from Alison. Sorry.
17 West Street, but it has 16 something or other on that, doesn't it? I don't know whether you walk past, you know, it's the front.
So that's Alison saying that she used to live in a cottage in West Street. There's also a date, 1600 and something.
Right, well, we'll get this written
So
down.
that's something else as well. So, yeah, I can see you'll be back here next year, if not before.
We can get more information then.
With an update, as we might say.
1964.
Yeah, there's an offer of 1964, but I think we could match that in a few houses in the village.
Let me show a couple more slides because,
Malcolm's just going to add a.
well, this is in a way the end of the old priest's house, and it's an example of how not to do it. They've got the downstairs drain pipe on the elevation of the house, but you have to have a toilet upstairs and you have to have a drain pipe, I suppose. But that's a typical view of the back of it, and that shows what it would have looked like without that one window when it was built. They were very simple houses and just long barns, but that's how the people lived. And these weren't impoverished medieval people. I mean, to have a house like that, you'd have to have quite a bit of land and be quite well to do, really. So that's the priest house as it looks as of to now, and the building materials are part of the reconstruction.
Okay.
Can I?
Yeah, John Diamond's going to step in a moment.
I've got 2 points.
2 points, right.
One, to say that there is a beautiful example of a crook house in Laycock. If you walk around the streets to the diagonal, the opposite corner from the entrance to the Abbey, right in the opposite corner of the village, you walk along the street and you are looking at the arch formed by these two massive tree trunks. It's a beautiful example of a crook house. And the other thing that I was going to say was an apology for the flying chimney. I did some photoshopping on the sky, and I obviously accidentally left a floating chimney. Sorry.
Nobody noticed. So don't worry.
Oh, I'm sure some people know.
Yes.
Okay, I'll say thanks again to Malcolm. And
Yes.
so the third and final part of this evening, thank you for your patience. John Diamond's going to reveal the mystery of the grey box on the table. I hope.
I shall stop this share for a moment and switch to there, and Is that this from the beginning? Yes, you know what it is now, exactly. And now I have to switch back again. This is really awkward having to do this and share my screen again. And the one I want to share is that. And here we are again. I'd like all that to go away, but I don't. No, I have to get rid of that. Stage wagon bells restored. I'm a bit confused because I'm not getting the screen on my laptop that I was expecting, but we'll carry on anyway. We've got lots of bells, and we're always looking for interesting bells. And we had an experience about 2-3 years ago. We belong to, come on, are you going to work? Come on. Yes. We had an offer out of the blue. We belong to a group called the Rural Museums Network. And this is simply a group of people like ourselves who subscribe to an email forum on the internet. You write an email to the forum asking a question, and everybody else will get a copy of that email, and they will, some of them hopefully will send you an answer. And we have conversations going between various rural museums across the country. It's quite useful sometimes. Sometimes we are able to answer questions for people. A couple of times we've put our own questions up and had them answered. But in the end of 2019, an email arrived with an attachment and a 46-page list of items which had been languishing for many years in the stores of Bristol City Museums, and which they no longer wanted because they didn't relate to Bristol. They had no intention ever of displaying these things. They had no reason to display them. And they thought they would be better off if they went to museums where these things were relevant and where they would be seen and would be used and would help to tell a local story. So we went through 46 pages of a list like this and came across, as you can see there at the top, a pair of horse bells in leather frame marked RW. Big bells ringing. Another set of stage bells, don't know about those. Another pair of horse bells marked RW. Perfect. And they're just giving these away. Further on, we came at the 4 carrier bells in leather holder marked IB, James Bridgman and Robert Wells. And here's the nice clue. It eventually, we found out eventually that actually all of these bells had been given to the museum in 1908 by one of the aldermen of Bristol. And they put them immediately into the store and they'd never ever come out. Anyway, we got in touch with the curator of Bristol Museum and said, we're very interested in, certainly in those 3 and maybe a couple of the other bell sets that you've got. So we got an invitation to go down, and Terry and I went down to Blaise Castle Museum, which is just on the outskirts, the western outskirts of Bristol. There is Blaise Castle Museum. And we weren't shown into the grand part. We were around the storeroom, around the back. And they got out these sets of bells. There was the 2 sets with the large crotals. There was the Bridgman and Wells set, which they were fine. There was the other set which we'd seen that wasn't identified. We looked at those. No, they're not local bells, so we're not interested in those. Please, we would very much like to have these 3 sets of bells that came from the village. That was all agreed. Those were ours, we could take them away. But oh, hold on though, we have another set. And they opened up an old box. And there was a mess of bells and leather and broken bits of wood and all kinds of stuff in there. And in fact, we realized that there it was in one of the pages that we'd seen. And you can see it does look odd as a set. And they're advertised as being stage wagon bells used in Herefordshire. Well, we didn't think there was any connection. When we looked at them, sure enough, those are Robert Wells bells. Do you want them? So Terry and I look at one another and say, what are we going to do with broken bells? What can we do with those? And they said, well, nobody else will want them. If you don't take them, we'll just have to dispose of them somehow. And Terry and I agreed that, well, we couldn't let that happen. We had no idea what we could do with them. So we took them anyway, packed them up, put them in the back of one of the cupboards in the Heritage Centre and tried to forget about them. And it stayed in that state really for over a year. And there we are, there are the bells, and you can see that there are bits missing. There are 2 bells missing. There's a chunk of wood missing. The leather is all frayed and lots of that is also missing. There's no way that we ourselves were going to be able to repair this. And so they stayed in the back of the cupboard until October 2020, when Heather Perry, who is our museums officer for Wiltshire, she came on one of her regular visits to the Heritage Centre, and she brought with her a young lady called Alison Foster, who is the chief conservator. And Alison was interested to see if we had anything that we wanted conserved or restored, because they were about to have a student who was studying museum conservation at, I think, at Bath University. And she was coming for a 9-month work placement, and they wanted some projects that they could give her to do. So we thought about, getting rid of the rust off some of the junk that's come out of the Band of Brothers digs, or straightening up this or that we had. And then the idea came, what about the broken bell set? So we got the broken bell set out of the cupboard, and Alison thought this was just brilliant. This is really quite a difficult thing to fix. That would be a really good project to give this young girl as one of her student projects. So Alison took it away for assessment, and a few weeks later, early December, we got information about what was wrong and what they could do. And we decided, yes, we'd go ahead with this. One of the benefits of this offer was that because the young lady who was going to be doing the work was a student, we didn't have to pay for her. So all of her labor was free. All we had to pay for were the bits and pieces, bits and bobs that she actually used. So the estimate for all this work that was going to have to restore these bells was £37.92, which we thought was a bit of a no-brainer, really. So yes, we commissioned that. So let's have a look at what the damage was. The leather and the wood, a lot of it had rotted away, and in rotting, pieces had fallen off and was now missing. Some bits were still with the bell set, but a lot of it had gone who knows where. And you can see how torn the leather was, the outer leather. There were 2 layers of leather, an inner really thick black layer and this outer pale layer. And the wood was absolutely riddled with insect holes. It had been attacked by woodworm, death watch beetle, who knows what had got to it. Sorry, I'm just clicked the wrong button. And also the leather was torn. I wonder, can I get rid of that thing there? Oh, I can shove it down there out of the way. That's better. The leather was torn, and it had gone stiff and it had warped, and it was really in a bad state. So that was the large part of the damage. While they were investigating what was wrong with it, they had a surprise. Anybody see the surprise? There was a nail from a repair that somebody had attempted many, many, many years before. There was a nail had been hammered into it to try to hold the thing together. So that had to be removed. And that's now in a little bag, which I hope we should find over there. And so they started on the conservation. And the first thing that they do is that they photograph everything. And they photograph it multiple times so that they have an exact record of the state that it was in when they received it. So there was our conservator. I keep touching these keys and must keep my, go away. What's happening is that I'm touching the touchpad as well as the arrow keys, which is what I'm trying to touch. I'm touching the touchpad. Anyway, they photographed it. And then it was brushed and vacuumed to get away all the dust and the loose dirt and the whole of the object. And that was quite a job as well. They used very specialist little vacuum cleaners, little tiny vacuum cleaners to do that job. And you can see Sejal there is wearing a mask to protect herself from the dust and spores of goodness knows what that she's disturbing there. And then the next job then was to consolidate the wood and fill all the insect holes. And they filled the insect holes with something which are called micro balloons. And it looks like a white powder, like very fine caster sugar. But each of the single pieces is actually a hollow glass sphere. And this is what they fill it with, and that's held in a matrix of a resin. And the resin is also soluble so that if they ever wanted to, they could remove all of the repair, because that's one of the tenets of museum conservation, is that you never do anything to an object that you can't reverse. And so even what they stuffed into all of the insect holes had to be possible to get it all out again. And this is the techniques that they've developed to do that kind of thing, and the materials that they've developed for that. Then number 4, she made a foam and papier-mâché filler piece, which was painted to match the leather that it was replacing and supporting, and it was then glued in place, again with a glue that can be removed if needed. It's not super glue or the kind of thing that you get from home base or wherever. And there you can see the filler piece being held in place with clamps as it's glued. And you can see how beautifully she's painted it to blend in with what it is that it's actually replacing and supporting. And then they wrapped the break area in a wet sandwich to humidify the leather, to make the leather a little pliable so that it could be bent back into shape and they could get rid of the warping in it. And it's a series of what look like little patches, and they're made what you can see pointing towards us is a piece of impervious plastic, mylar. Then there's a sheet of blotting paper, which is soaked in distilled water. And then if anybody is a golfer or even a hiker, they will have come across a material called Gore-Tex, which is a waterproof material in one direction, but a breathable material in the other direction. It lets it, in a golfer's suit, it keeps the rain out, but it lets the sweat out as well. And in this case, they want the moisture to go from the blotting paper very, very gently and slowly into the leather. They don't want to shock the leather. They want it to just absorb very, very gently, become humidified and supple. And that's what's happening there. And that takes some time for that to happen. And then they support the broken and frayed leather using conservation grade polyester fabric, which you can see Sejal there has painted, again, using acrylic paints. Again, this is all reversible. She's painted it so that it matches the leather that it's replacing and supporting. There she is, getting it into position. And here it is clamped into position and glued so that it remains now in place. Then they consolidate the powdery leather surfaces. This outer leather had gone very friable, and you could rub it and it would just come off like dust coming off the leather. And they consolidated that using an adhesive called, I think, Klucel, which is what pharmaceutical companies use to bind medicine to make pills. So when you take your Rivaroxaban or whatever pills that you take, what you're swallowing is a lump of this adhesive that was used to protect our leather. With the medicine is sort of embedded in this matrix of gummy stuff, and that's what they use. Very strange set of materials they use. Then they clean the bells very gently with something that ladies will be much more familiar with, nail polish remover, acetone. A very, very dilute solution of acetone is a very good cleaner for all things metal and ceramic. And I've used it myself to clean up an antique clock. But yes, they just a very gentle clean. There's absolutely no polishing. They're not interested in polishing them, just in getting the 200 years worth of dust off them. And finally, the conservation was complete. And there is the set of bells after its conservation. We still have 2 bells missing, but they've long gone, so there's no attempt to replace them. That wouldn't be the same set of bells if we put new ones in. So it will remain 2 bells short, but it is now in the shape that it should be. It is now something that if we can find enough room, we can display. There are finally 2 final jobs that needed to be done to finish. The first was to make a supporting mount for it, which is done out of foam and linen and various other odds and ends to make a support for it so that it can be displayed or it can be moved, and to make a storage box for it. There is the storage box. There is the storage box. And that's some idea of the sorts of materials that they used to carry out all that conservation. And our bill. As they said, £37.92 that we've paid, a wonderful amount of work, most fantastic bargain. And so it's very much thanks to Heather Perry, who's our museums officer, Alison Foster, who's the chief conservator, who suggested that we find something for Sejal Goal, who was the student who did all the work for us. And we're very, very grateful to them. And that's the end of my talk, and I'll go and open the box.